Okay, welcome everyone to the second real lecture of 2021. We hope you're ready for another enthralling lecture. Before we get started, we'd like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Tonight's guests are James Taylor and Peter Knights from Taylor Knights. Taylor Knights are a Melbourne-based architect and interior designers, specialising in highly refined and sensitive residential and commercial design, and have most recently worked on Ponder as the winners of the NGV's 2021 Architecture Commission in the Grollo Equisette Garden at NGV International. Tonight, they'll be taking us through a lecture entitled Creating Connection as part of this trimester's overarching theme of SMLXL, the Scales of Architecture. All right, and for now, I'll hand over to James and Peter.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to talk tonight. Yeah, we feel very privileged to be able to give this talk. I know myself have sort of had the been lucky enough to listen to some fantastic talkers and architects over the years, so it's a real privilege to be able to have the opportunity to talk through some of our work and sort of reflect on what we've done over the last couple of years. So tonight's talk, I guess, to tie into your theme for the semester, is called Creating Connection. So it's sort of about talking about some of the, I guess, the key themes in our work. Ironically, for two architects that are originally from the country, we've never really done too much city, country or rural work. We've sort of predominantly worked in the city on sort of really small, challenging sites. But I think our background as country people, a lot of our design approach in terms of landscape, materiality, connection to place, I guess comes from our background. So tonight we sort of referenced a quote from one of our favourite sort of architects, Peter Zunther, Thinking Architecture, which sort of talks about, you know, your biography and how that, you know, in the spaces and places you've been to kind of, I guess, affect the type of work you do and I guess how you approach projects and design. So the two images are, I guess, my home farm in the Northwest Grampians and the Hauqua, which is where Peter's from. So those themes around, I guess the three you'll sort of see in the 5 projects that we'll go through tonight. They're sort of connection to place, landscape, and materiality and craft in our work. So the range of projects start with really small projects at the start of our practice through to the NGV, which we're currently working on right now. So we're really passionate about architecture that is connected to its people and its surroundings, and really heightens the experience of place. As architects for us has the potential to transform the way we live and experience the world in a really positive way. So our ideas and approach for each project emerge from a really strong understanding of place.
Just on just a couple of images we've got in the background, just to quickly touch on that. A lot of the way that we present our work from the concept perspective is a lot of the time through hand sketch, just to kind of set up some of the ideas and some of the emotive qualities that we're trying to capture through the design process. And so these are just a couple of examples of that that you can see in the background.
So connection to nature is integral to our projects. So we place, I suppose, equal consideration on, I guess, the landscape and the architecture when designing our work. So strong interaction between the building and landscape, is transformative in the way it sort of brings a lot of, beautiful qualities to the space, joy, beauty, the change of seasons. So we tend to go for sort of small and high quality and with larger gardens rather than sort of bigger buildings. And we really carefully sort of frame and consider these kind of the connections between the two. The last element, I think that we sort of put a lot of weight on in our work is materiality and craft, which is sort of really important in our projects to create atmosphere and encourage a lot of interactions between the building and the site. So utilize materials that are beautiful to come into contact with, and the particular qualities that they bring to, I guess, heighten the sense of connection to a site. Do
you want me to control this?
Yeah, perhaps if you control that, Pete. So the first project we're going through tonight was a really early one that we sort of started in our second year of practice in 2014. It's for the Brunswick West House. It was a house, a California bungalow in fairly poor condition. You can sort of see from the front, had a fairly disjointed sort of layout with a very poor connection to its external sort of north-facing backyard. Yeah, so you can sort of see in the floor plan, living spaces sort of faced a western sideway. The main living area sort of faced the front car park with sort of bathrooms at the key areas opening out onto the back.
I guess what we find as well with a lot of heritage buildings is they're very insular. They're often quite dark spaces. There's not a great kind of connection to the outdoor, whether that's kind of garden or cross ventilation, natural light. And so a lot of the time, one of the first things that we try and do is establish, how can we start to create those connections on the floor plan. You can see here with the, we've got 2 different zones, the shared program and the private program. But you need to kind of enjoy that north-facing backyard. You really need to go through, the amenity at the back that's not necessarily connected to like living spaces or, any way that can naturally form that connection between inside and out.
So the project itself had a very small project budget. So the design strategy was really quite simple. Add a really smaller extension at the back, really mindful of size. So this sort of extension was only sort of under 50 meters, and then rework what's already there in terms of plans. So close in the original entry to sort of increase the existing footprint and then sort of rework what's already there in terms of the existing rooms. So a new sort of pathway down the side of the house sort of takes advantage of the lush sort of planting, and then comes into a new extension, which is sort of only, I think, about 48, 49 meters. So we really emphasized this project, and I think it's sort of run through a lot of our other projects, is this emphasis on really good, smart design over large sort of extensions. So because we went with a smaller sort of footprint, it meant we could sort of use better quality materials and detailing in the project. So the project, because of its budget, really mindful of that, how we connected to the original house. So in section, the building sits underneath the existing eaves to ensure we don't kind of adjust we don't have to make expensive changes to the older building. And in plan, the main, the primary living spaces are arranged around its sort of 3 sculptural masonry walls, creating nooks and intricate zones within the open plan, intimate spaces to sit, and also those kind of communal spaces for the family as well. So even though we did have to go with that open plan, we were able to sort of, I guess, work with that brick and the kind of the curved brick detailing to create, I guess, subtle nuances within the space.
I think partly as well, we kind of wanted to respond in a way that was creative and kind of unique to the family, rather than, necessarily just adding a box on the back. It was how do you, add the box, but, create kind of connection through, sculptural walls and, framing aspects of the garden. Through here, we can start to see some of the detailing, using the brickwork and starting to create some of those, nice curves and angles to start to soften it, and then kind of allowing that to start to frame aspects of the garden.
So with this project, not a huge budget, but we used a lot of sort of standard materials. So the only sort of, I guess, tricky thing was just the laying of the bricks. The materials were sort of off the shelves with brick shapes and a traditional sort of red recycled bricks. So some of the detailing to create those 3 kind of sculptural kind of blades. So doing sort of the set out, you can sort of see on the slab. Half bricks to get the radius on the entry area, and then sort of bricked up up to the eave. So with this particular project, we actually had a specialist bricklayer to do those kind of more complex pieces, and then a normal bricklayer to do the straight runs. And then the sort of final sort of results, so the architectural photography again. So it's a really sort of modest footprint, but with a very kind of robust sort of palette with the green concrete scree, which sort of references the colours in the yard, and the white painted brickwork. The client was really keen on this brickwork being so close to some of the original brickyards in Melbourne, which sort of started out in that Brunswick area. So those, I guess, mix of spaces. So where you have the communal spaces, you have these kind of little private sort of day beds within the space. And then the kitchen area with a skylight sort of on the southern side to sort of let light deep into the deepest, into the back of the living space. And the rear facade, sort of with the apertures framing.
Oh, sorry, can't go back.
Yeah.
So this is another project that we did, which was kind of quite early on in our career. We were quite fortunate that the particular client came to us because we were the closest architect. They had previously gone to another architectural firm that was slightly larger than us, well, much larger, more established, and was turned away because the budget was too small. And we were fortunate that we were just down the road. So we ended up getting this project, which was great because the clients were great, and it was a nice challenging brief for us. So it's called the Fitzroy Terrace House. It's basically in Fitzroy. The site is quite granular in that, you know, you've got this kind of continuous heritage front. It's one of these kind of 4 terrace houses. The width of the block is only 5 meters in width, and then the whole site is only about 128 square meters. So it's quite a tight tight site, facing north-south. So that's kind of like a south-facing backyard. You can see there in the red dot is the actual site. So they're kind of long, skinny blocks. Basically hemmed in on both sides. There was kind of really lacking in kind of natural amenity. So very poor connection to the outdoors, very little light, very little circulation. It's pretty standard sort of Victorian terrace, in that it had if you have a look at the ground floor plan at the top, you had the bedroom at the front, a little kind of lounge nook, and then a kitchen, which then had a tacked on laundry and powder room at the back, and then zero connection to the rear yard, which was kind of south facing and concrete. So there wasn't a lot happening out there anyway. But you can see that the kind of connection to that amenity was really lacking. Moving upstairs, you've got another 3 bedrooms, a bathroom in the middle, and then the outdoor spaces are 2 balconies, but the balconies are only accessible from private bedrooms. So they're not kind of spaces that could be kind of enjoyed by, you know, whether you have, you know, friends over or, you know, anyone over a sort of public space. So for us, that was kind of one of the things that we really wanted to change sort of straight off the bat. It was then kind of around establishing those rules and, you know, how do we respond to that site and start to open it up through kind of connection and, you know, and natural light.
So the first part was establishing the demolition point, which you can sort of see was on the back of the front 2 rooms. And then the building mass was sort of established by the zoning, which sort of went up to the ridge line of the original building. The form was sort of pushed back and pulled back on the sides, just to ensure we kind of protected the amenity of the surrounding properties. And then a series of kind of green spaces were integrated across all of the floor levels. So right at ground level, a little courtyard, a courtyard sort of where the staircase comes up, and then courtyards on each of the levels above.
Because it's south facing and quite a narrow block, we had to really work the building form. So, you know, that's why we're kind of pushing and pulling in certain areas. Otherwise, what we'll find is we start to kind of overshadow and overlook the neighbouring properties, which are really only a couple of metres away.
The form is quite a complex sort of angular form. So stitching it together was really important. We quite often go with our response in terms of materiality to be quite monolithic. It's be quite pleasing to, I guess, have that use that one material rather than be quite, you know, complex with lots of different joints and a lot of material. So using that brick, detailing in a way that kind of provides articulation and relief. So the form can sort of wrap up, sort of enclosing the kind of courtyard spaces and work as walls and balustrades. The next step was sort of removing a section of roof to create almost what we call the lungs of the building. So this 4.5 metre height void, which allows northern light to come into the heart of a really long, narrow site. Skylight on the south allows further light to sort of come into the centre of the house as well. So the result is it sort of flips the traditional terrace typology on its head by sort of inverting the living position and creating a series of quite dynamic spaces with double height sort of volumes, getting northern light into the space, and then these kind of more intimate zones for dining and opportunities for connection out into Fitzroy as well that were previously unavailable.
I think that it's such a small footprint as well. We kind of needed to work we needed to work all the spaces pretty hard. So that was the floor plan, and also kind of working with heights and step levels. That way we can kind of make something that's quite compressed feel much more expansive, both through the kind of the vertical plane and the horizontal plane. So just kind of skimming through the plans, if we kind of look at the zoomed in section of upstairs, basically keeping the heritage aspects, so the bedroom at the front, the second living at the top, and then really kind of opening up that whole kind of first floor. That kind of allowed that quite insular small space to feel quite expansive. So rather than having, compartmentalized rooms up there, all of a sudden, we're standing in the kitchen, we're looking all the way to the end of our tidal boundary. And because we're stepped down that sunken lounge, we can actually start to get those city views. So we're kind of really pushing and pulling the floor plan really hard to make a small space feel quite large. That dashed line in the kitchen is that kind of 4.5 metre curved ceiling. So because north faces the street, that's where we start to get that really beautiful wash of natural light, like James said, into the kind of the heart of the home, which we kind of refer to as the lungs, where we can start to get that kind of light and ventilation through there. Coming into the kind of the dining area, it compresses down to 2.4 metres. So it starts to become a little bit more intimate for that dining experience. And then we kind of step down into the sunken lounge. So the floor plane kind of drops. And then again, we start to kind of create a little bit more intimacy in this open floor plan. But then that kind of spills out to this outdoor area. So we start to get this seamless connection between indoors and outdoors. And then just trying to provide some kind of green relief. So in that floor plan, you've got sections of garden, off to the south, but you've also got opportunities on the ground plane for trees to grow up from the ground floor to be appreciated on the first floor and above.
So in section, really dynamic sort of spatial volumes. The lower dining area allows us to get this additional outdoor space, which is sort of on that second story, getting great views across Fitzroy. We've tried a lot of design tricks here to sort of really ensure that the spatial quality is high. So utilising perforated stairs to get light down to the lower level below. By lowering the sunken lounge allows the dining space to suddenly almost feel like you're on a stage and you're not looking at the back of a couch, you're looking out through that, out to the laneways of Fitzroy.
I think that the beautiful thing about that gesture too is rather than kind of looking at the back of a couch, and because of the height of the balustrade, you can actually start to get city views from that dining space. So you don't necessarily need to go right up onto the roof deck to start to get that really kind of expansive vista. It just means that, it feels much more kind of open and connected than what it previously was. And then just some kind of construction photos. So originally it's about establishing, what part of the building deserves to be kept, what's got the good bones, and what parts are just dangerous. The front balcony was one of those situations that was just dangerous. So we removed that and then kind of established the right point to demolish from the rear.
The formwork at the rear for the large volume at the back. So we used concrete for its material quality. It provided a beautiful rawness juxtaposed against the smoother kind of materials in the interior space. Also allowed us to kind of be a bit more efficient in terms of structure. So being able to fit within the height guidelines that we were restricted by. And the material itself worked really beautifully for creating curves that we perhaps couldn't have done with plaster so well.
I think as well, because, it's such a big northern light scoop. If you try and, use something that is kind of imperfect like concrete, there's a kind of a natural beauty that comes out of that when the light hits it. We've done previous projects where we've done kind of curved plaster. And unless you absolutely nail that plaster, any bit of light, any kind of imperfection will get highlighted as soon as the light hits it. So part of the approach here was, how do those kind of imperfections start to become kind of, beautiful elements that can, help to kind of highlight the craft or the quality of the space. And so part of the decision-making process was using barge board that kind of could get us that full expanse in one length from, you know, site boundary to site boundary, and then kind of allowing them to be kind of stepped and slightly apart, so we could start to get some of these dags in the concrete coming through. So we really didn't want to be precious with it. We wanted those kind of dags and imperfections to really start to be highlighted once it's finished and the light starts to respond to it or bring it to life.
So you can sort of see at this stage, it is a very raw building.
You can also see on the right-hand side of that image, the brick blade wall is kind of slightly offset from the existing wall, which we needed to rebuild in the end. But just to start to get that kind of slither of northern light through that element into the sunken lounge, again, as a way of kind of highlighting that brick blade wall that's slightly on an angle. The construction of that wall is done in a Flemish bond, which is basically the same construction of the existing house. So it's the existing brickwork that was done in the late 1900s kind of ties into the element that we've added in the rear.
And then you can see that more of that sort of Flemish detail along the southern facade, and a kind of like a capping detail with the brick that sort of wraps all the way around. We sort of talked about it originally as sort of being the idea of sort of stitching it all together. So it's really kind of cohesive. And the paint was an important part of that, of bringing it all back together. So all these bricks were sort of recycled bricks from Paddy's bricks. So some architectural photos sort of showing that brickwork sort of all tied together. We were really fortunate to be able to access a roof a couple of doors up to be able to sort of capture this shot, which we think sort of captures the complexity of the form. And you're looking at the sort of the front of the restored Victorian terrace with, a lot of it brought back to life.
So just some interior photos that just start to show that these kind of sections. I mean, what you're looking at on that right image is of the master ensuite. Again, it cranks out, so it basically steps up higher than the ceiling plane to kind of get that northern light into the shower recess. So really kind of just trying to work every part of the design to bring in kind of natural amenity.
The staircase, where you can sort of see the stair runner aligns with the perforated stairs above, and utilising that perforated kind of sheet metal to get light to the lower levels below. So that those spaces get plenty of light because of the characteristics of these kind of sites, long, narrow, they tend to be very dark.
Just a heritage room at the front, basically, just re-establishing this and then adding some new joinery and lights and colour. So not a huge amount was done in there rather than kind of restoring it.
The lungs of the building, so the 4.5 metre void to bring in northern light, and you can sort of see that juxtaposition between I guess raw and smooth quite clearly, and also that kind of really super sharp and very kind of rough and coarse concrete. We've looked at sort of ways of getting more light by even sort of setting the stair off the wall as well, so the light sort of just comes down the side of the staircase. Because it's a really narrow site, utilising steel plate to sort of maximise circulation space, so for those kind of corridors beside the island. And the island's sort of design is a very much a communal kind of island, so the cook, because the client, this particular client, loves to cook, that sort of the actual it's on the center of the island, just so they can sort of engage with people that are in the space. Looking back towards the dining area, where the dining area sits above the sunken lounge, to create that almost sort of theatre-like sort of stage where you can sort of get views towards the city.
A lot of the a lot of the furniture in this project has also been kind of custom designed, partly because the space is so small. We kind of needed it to kind of fit perfectly and proportionally to each of the spaces. So the bay window is obviously, has been kind of designed, but also the dining room table, we've started to kind of work out proportionally how that would fit and cut it out of one piece of marble, and then kind of built in furniture into the sunken lounge as well.
The sunken lounge with the skylight bringing light into the heart of the house, and then the paving, which sort of carries from the inside right to the outside, and then adding these kind of playful circulation with the spiral stairs that sort of comes down, the roof line that sort of has a sort of a chain bringing all the water down to the garden below as well. So the next project called Horizon House. It's a project in Pascoe Vale South. This client actually came to us after sort of seeing the Brunswick West House. They loved brickwork, and they particularly loved kind of, I guess, curved and quite sculptural architecture. So the house is in a pretty interesting area. It's very close to the Calder Freeway. And I guess one of the big things you notice when you come to site, so the site is this building here on the left, is the size of the houses. So these houses, we sort of checked REA dimensions, and they're sort of 400 to 500 meters. A lot of them, this one here and the one in the back, around the 400 to 500. The client's budget would never kind of meet that kind of size budget. So it was really about coming up with a design that could sort of, I guess, almost meet those requirements of a suburban home, but do it in a much more efficient way. So the block has really quite challenging constraints. So it goes from 8 meters down to the street. So a massive height difference between the lower section and the higher section. And it has a sort of a pizza shaped configuration. So the design is quite simple. It's sort of retained the existing footprint of where the original building was built. And it sort of has a lower section for kind of 2 rooms and storage, and then a kind of like a laundry on the other side, and then a sort of like a main 1-bedroom kind of living apartment above. And by sort of spanning between these 2 spaces allowed us to put in a carport for free. Basically, we're not paying for it. It's similar to like a mid-century kind of home where the carport was under the house. By sort of raising the living area, it also allowed us to address some of the big issues with height. So connecting the back of the yard. So by bringing the living up to that higher level, we could suddenly just build a bridge across and take advantage of that large green space at the very back.
The house as well, it's called Horizon House for a reason, and that's partly because the views are pretty epic, not to mention the language of the architecture. And so part of kind of raising all your living spaces again onto that kind of first floor really takes advantage of that. And then helps us to kind of connect in with that upper tier of the rear yard. So this is a section, a section kind of where you can see the carport under, you can see the living room and the kitchen, and then the bridge that goes across to the upper level on the north.
So the house is, I guess it's a juxtaposition between something really solid and then something very kind of light, almost like a lantern on the top with glass going to the very top of the ceiling. The idea of being on a really sort of quite exposed hill, this idea of prospect and refuge was a really big part of our design thinking, so creating a beautiful sort of sheltered space to enjoy these really expansive views. So the house sort of, yeah, on the lower level, it's very kind of low maintenance. So it's a couple that just lived there with 2 dogs. So they didn't have kids, and so the lower levels was more used for sort of study and a guest space. There was spaces that they wouldn't be using so much. So the approach was to create spaces that could be easily sort of zoned off. So they didn't need to heat or cool them the majority of the time, but they were there when they needed to be. So moving up to the first floor level, it's quite a sort of a fluid floor plan with a lot of sort of sliding doors, able to sort of enclose, sort of close down spaces, but also expand spaces. So coming up the staircase, you have kind of like a master bedroom wing on the western side, taking advantage of the southern views towards the city and the northern light. And then on the eastern side, sort of a lounge, dining, and sort of kitchen. The form sort of follows the shape of the title block. So tonight we started to show, I guess, some construction photos of each project and perhaps elements that kind of we find interesting in each of the projects. This one, I think some of the challenging aspects was to get that really light glass lantern-like effect at the top. So we engineered this one slightly different. So it's kind of got a lot of cold galvanized kind of purlins in this one to allow us to sort of almost minimize structure on the southern side, so we can achieve, I guess, those really beautiful views towards the city. So you can see the design sort of takes advantage of the views by incorporating day beds, joinery for cooking, so you can enjoy that view and that interaction with the street at all times. There's also a desk a little bit further along. So more kind of finished photos with kind of the banding brick effect to sort of emphasize that upper level brick banding. And then curved brickwork, so curved inwards to allow like a undercover area to enter into the building. It's a very kind of raw site at handover, and they're actually just putting in their garden right at this minute. So we're hoping to photograph it later this year.
So we've only got renders for now.
We really only have renders at the moment, but we have a native garden going in.
Yeah. But you can see there that we've really opened up the north and the south. So it very much is a horizontal plane. The north obviously has an eave. The south doesn't need the eave. And so we're able to kind of, start to kind of work those two planes. So we get these beautiful views both sides. And then the view out towards the south, towards the city, kind of is kind of unimposed because it's just one kind of glass sort of curtain wall. Yeah, and then kind of there that you're basically standing in the kitchen looking over the dining and lounge area. And then, you kind of move around that kind of that core in the center where your stair comes up and move into that master suite, which can be kind of closed off. You can see on the left-hand side, you've got the little study nook, which James was talking about earlier, and then kind of like a day bed, which sort of ties into the wall plane. So hopefully we'll have some photographs of this project either end of this year or early next. So we're looking forward to that. So the next house is the Melbourne Garden House. So we've kind of slowly started to kind of go from small to large through the presentation. So and almost sequential in order, actually, from the first project to that we first got through our, through the journey of our business, really, with each project is sort of that we presented has come one after the other. And so this project is a pretty big house in Melbourne. The extension that we did on the back, again, is quite modest, but we knew from the first site visit that it was a pretty special project. And that's because the site itself was quite magical. You went out the back and you almost felt like you were in the country. You know, we had these terracing levels and it was kind of very peaceful, but the existing house just had very kind of little connection to it. So we knew from the very beginning that was one of the first things that we kind of needed to address. You know, how do we open up that northern wall? That facade that you're looking at the moment is the northern facade. And so again, you can see it's quite insular in nature, in that there's not a huge amount of kind of openings out towards the north.
So one of the, I guess, the unique things we sort of picked up on site was the terracing, which probably played into our approach with the green roof that you'll sort of see. So these kind of really interesting kind of level changes that sort of had no connection with the existing building, which was fairly disjointed and actually had only a single door opening out to this really beautiful established garden. So pushing this idea of terracing into the new piece of architecture that would be inserted there. So the new house sort of was very, again, like our other projects, was quite small in footprint. So it was about a 40-metre square sort of extension. And it was around this idea of the kitchen as the sort of centre or the command centre, with really beautiful connection out to the garden and back to the house. So we reworked rooms to allow day beds and window seats that would always give strong connection back to this kind of communal space at the heart of the home.
And back to the garden too. You know, we kind of knew that was a bit of a hero for the project. So how we can kind of start to open up walls in the north and crank out bay windows, you know, one near the pool and one in the kids' rumpus room, back out onto that garden, we knew would kind of be a key to start to establish those connections. I think similar to our previous houses, it was quite compartmentalized. And so we just wanted to kind of rework the existing bones quite hard so we could kind of capitalize on what was already there. And it didn't need, you know, major reworking. It was kind of just about kind of rationalizing the space and then adding kind of a modest footprint.
On plan, you can sort of see you have this, I guess, this upper level where the extension and position with so great connection to the lower levels. So you've got really good sight line across the site, and then a mid-level and then a lower level. Situating the addition atop the highest level of the site, you know, gave you these great views across the whole building. You can sort of see in this section, it sort of starts to explain that idea of the terracing. So you've got this kind of fourth terrace that we sort of called it, which was a green roof, which meant all these possible views from the windows on the first floor of the original building. You're looking out to this really sort of soft green landscape. And I guess from a comfort point of view, it's created a really comfortable building for the owners in terms of, you know, maintaining a really steady temperature in the space.
I think as well, because of this project, you know, it is over 3 levels. You know, part of it is about how do you get the kind of the landscape to work over those 3 levels. And so part of the kind of thinking for that upper floor is, you know, reusing that 4th terrace as which is kind of above the kitchen area, from what James called the kind of the command center, the kitchen dining area. You've kind of got a view kind of across the whole backyard. So you're looking out towards the north and the swimming pool. You're looking down to the mid terrace and the lower terrace. From the lounge room, you're kind of looking out onto that mid terrace. So you've got a big kind of 5-meter kind of glazed northern window that kind of looks sort of gun barrel down that kind of outdoor northern kind of mid-level. And then actually on the lower ground level is a guest wing. And so part of that is, you know, activating that bottom garden so you can start to kind of get connection from that guest wing. You know, you can open up the doors and then kind of spill out to that lower terrace. So each kind of part of the garden, you know, needed to be kind of activated. And part of the thinking was, how do we create that through kind of utilizing these different zones across the multiple levels?
And I think one of the really great opportunities with this particular project was that the client had a young family, and they wanted a kind of engaging and playful garden. So they wanted spaces where their kids could play hide and seek, and lots of steps and engaging elements. So there's slides, there's these kind of almost like national park like web forged sort of platforms where the plants grow through, lots of opportunities to sort of gather and sit in all parts of the yard. So just an AXO drawing showing sort of that, I guess that modest sort of extension in relation to the, I guess, the original building. So this project, I suppose the main feature is the kind of the concrete green roof. So just showing the skylight at the very back, which sort of frames some existing birch trees on the side. Again, sort of looking back towards the pavilion, and you can sort of see, I guess, the idea of the green roof is that it will soften the extension and allow it to sort of tie into the landscape and merge over time.
So here you can see the corner of that kitchen dining area. We've added a column, but the glass kind of sits inside that. And once you'll see from the photos is that corner really opens up. There's two pretty special trees in the backyard. You've got a really big elm and oak tree in the backyard. And so part of the design kind of, you know, frames that, and part of the landscape kind of process has been about kind of showcasing them as well. And so they provide quite beautiful shade in the summer, and then in the winter they kind of lose all their leaves, and that kind of, you know, beautiful wash of winter light starts to come through into that kind of quite open plan section. So here's a kind of a photo looking at the northern facade of the extension once it's done. You can see the kind of the corbelling concrete on the right hand side that kind of almost works as a bit of a sundial. Part of that kind of design motif is really taken from some of the heritage features that were already existing in the house. It had these brick stepped details that we've started to kind of replicate in concrete, and that kind of helps to create quite a strong kind of corner to the pavilion. They angle out as well, similar to the windows, so that they kind of angle out towards the view in a way of kind of, you know, making the architecture kind of embrace the landscape.
Windows that sort of crank back to sort of have that connection back to the communal spaces. You can see that in the top right hand section there's that kind of corbelled brickwork near the eave. So that there's those kind of references that were already there that we sort of tied back into.
You can also see on that image on the right, I mean, that was where that, you know, really large fixed window is. That was originally where that kind of that brick wall was on the northern facade. So I've really just tried to open that whole section up so that you start to connect with the living room back onto that kind of outdoor terrace. We worked with a really good landscaper, Ben Scott too, who we kind of looked at engaging with at the design development phase, so we could start to kind of think about how the landscaping would start to kind of work in with the architecture. You can see another corbelling detail in that left-hand image. Again, it kind of reaches out to connect in with the garden and creates a kind of a cornerstone to the section of the pavilion. And then some of the web forging in the previous image, where the grasses start to kind of come up through, so you can come out, open up the window, and kind of sit on that ledge when you have your morning coffee. And then kind of, you know, that the kind of life starts to grow up through that kind of web forged flooring.
Always in our work, we'd love to have places for people to sort of occupy and enjoy those views. So window seats, quite a few of them in this particular project for, you know, kids to sort of sit when mum and dad are in the kitchen preparing dinners and so on. So really good social spaces.
And also having a big window, so if, you know, kids are in the pool, you know, you've got really good visibility. You know, some of these kind of practical elements where, you know, the parent wants to make sure that if the kid's out there swimming, that they've got a really good kind of visible connection to it. It's like little practical things that kind of, I guess, need to be kind of at the cornerstone of the design, but done in a way that kind of starts to be quite poetic and beautiful.
The kitchen area, the skylight in the background, and just some of those other details. So the corbelling brickwork, the web forge with the boulders popping through as steps. Some of the work inside the existing part of the house, so carrying the timbers through. Gardens with their own kind of very private kind of courtyards.
And so that kind of left-hand image is kind of something you didn't really touch on earlier, but part of the kind of the new pavilion kitchen, living, dining area is kind of offset from the existing front part of the house. So we kind of reworked that front part to create a master suite, walk-in robe, and an ensuite at the back. And that kind of separation between the new wing allowed us to bring in a kind of a new courtyard. So it was quite private, but gave us that kind of really nice kind of connection again with garden. And then just some kind of more images that kind of looking towards the north at that big oak tree, the kind of and some other kind of elements that kind of wash through.
So the last project, I guess, to talk about tonight is the NGV Architecture Commission. So it's a collaboration we're doing with James Carey, the artist, who also teaches at RMIT. So it's a project at the rear of the existing NGV. So I guess we've sort of started with each of our projects with sort of existing sort of site photos. So I guess some of our original, I guess discussion around this building was around the beautiful kind of open air kind of courtyard spaces. So this photo is taken in 1969 with the three still open. They're now kind of enclosed. One was an Asian garden and one was an Australian garden. And then the other one was the sort of the central area that one came into when they sort of come through the main central arch.
I think it's probably also worth kind of noting with this particular project as well, we kind of came at it from a very kind of conceptual perspective. There was an opportunity in this particular project because it's for kind of the NGV and as part of the commission. It's quite open in terms of how you approach it. And so part of the kind of original dialogue was, sitting down as a studio and sitting down with James Carey and kind of, talking about some of the things that kind of really matter to us and what's important. And I guess a lot of stuff had come out of COVID and, the year that was quite oppressive, which we're kind of really still experiencing. But it was kind of an opportunity of what are some of the concerns at the moment. And, we'd just come out of sort of devastating bushfires when we'd started this. We were kind of looking at everything that was going on with, climate change. And, we really wanted something that would kind of address that, but kind of look at it with kind of optimistic eyes as well. So have a kind of have a design which kind of talks to what's currently going on, but doing it in a way that provides an opportunity to kind of to reflect, to enjoy, to discuss, to engage with. And so the NGV, it became kind of like the framework of the NGV became kind of the framework in what we created from a conceptual perspective.
So you can sort of see in this particular image, the original courtyard sort of framed the Balzac and the draped woman sort of statues. The reason I sort of like to show these images, I guess, is how our design sort of reinterprets these courtyards.
And partly these two sculptures have been moved out into the Grollo garden too, which is where our kind of new courtyard that we've created actually exists. So in fact, what's actually happened is the existing courtyards and the sculptures have been kind of brought out, and we've kind of reframed this courtyard in the Grollo garden. So the design proposal basically ghosts one of the original central courtyards in terms of similar proportions and square. It also kind of mirrors the opening. So the opening where you come from the Great Hall out
into the rear gardens. We have a similar kind of portal that sort of signifies the entry to the installation. So there's really powerful geometry and proportions in the square that you see in Roy Grounds building. And the square also, as an idea, is a really important public space that's you see in all cities around the world as a place for gathering and discussing of ideas. So we also like that idea of the square as a tool to frame our installation. So we sort of established a square that was sort of offset from the existing building. It's then split by some of the features that are already there on site. So this bluestone bench that cuts through the site was the division between land and water in our particular proposal. And then the last image sort of shows, I guess, what's already there. So we very carefully negotiate the existing elements and sort of embrace them. So instead of removing things, we sort of work with what's there. So there's no kind of, I guess, heavy kind of construction going on.
And so part of what we're really responding to here is kind of land and water custodianship. You know, how do we start to care for these kind of the land and water that exists within our climate? And how do we kind of showcase that in a way that's beautiful, that's interactive, that's kind of reflective, hence the kind of where the name Ponder came from. And so part of that as a framework was how do we kind of integrate that into the Grollo garden? And we did that by kind of establishing, you know, these principles that would come from the courtyard. And so the same dimensions and everything are kind of mirrored out into that Grollo garden. And then the existing elements within the Grollo garden we've used as a way of deciphering this land component and this water component. So there's an existing bluestone bench, which is kind of the divisive element between the land and the water, which was in place. So that became the natural division between those two elements. And then the two existing pergolas that are currently there also kind of, you know, formed the north and the southern kind of entrance point. So again, they kind of bookend both of the elements. So we started to kind of form, again, this kind of courtyard around these existing elements, responding to currently what's already in the garden itself, as opposed to really wanting to impose something on top of it. It's kind of how do we embrace what's there and kind of use that to talk around this concept.
So the plan is a series of kind of walkways around the space, reminiscent of what you'd sort of see in national parks. So with kind of like a web forge material. And through, as you walk through the space, come through the entry, you start to experience, you know, spaces that are really suited for groups to discuss some of these kind of key themes and ideas, and then sort of more sort of personal spaces, the benches that sort of wrap around this water and land. In terms of materiality, there was a real a lot of consideration about reuse, circular economy, and the project sort of, you know, really thinking about materials and how they're used post-project. So trying to use things to maintain their kind of modular size. They could be repurposed by different land care groups and community groups that will use these materials afterwards. So you can see in terms of the material palette down the bottom, we have sort of web forge, gabion, sort of rocks. So there are a lot of kind of landscape elements that will be sort of used in the project. This is also a big part of the NGV's brief as well, to sort of really consider that the lifespan of the products and where they will go.
And so part of the design thinking was kind of working with, you know, where, you know, who is likely to take these materials and, you know, do they want them? How can they reuse them? And so part of that was considered as we're going through that kind of design process. So the water itself, for example, taps into the existing moats. So there's obviously the moat that kind of wraps around the NGV courtyard, forms the water wall, and, you know, runs under the bridge that's currently there when you come through the Great Hall to the Grollo Garden. Our pavilion kind of uses that water and kind of taps into it. So again, it's kind of looking at using the kind of in this case, it's local ecology and kind of showcasing it in a way that, you know, allows people to start to interact with it. And in that way, that every kind of bit of material that we've put into this project, we've kind of spoken to the end user before we finalised the design to ensure that they can use it and it will have a second life. So, you know, one of the things that we really didn't want was for any of this project to end up in landfill. You know, we wanted to make sure that any element that's going into it can be reused and have a second life. And in that way, it's kind of, it feels like it's a responsible response, I guess, to this idea of land and water and how we're using design to tell a story and to kind of reach to the broader community in a way that is hopefully kind of reflective, but also enjoyable because you can interact with it. You know, you can walk through it. The design has changed slightly.
Yeah, so
it has been refined.
Yes, it's currently under construction. So this is a sort of a section cut through part of the pond. So originally we sort of had sand as a leveler to create that level base for the pond. But because of the weight, we have replaced it with kind of timber framing that will be able to be sort of pulled out quite simply and reused by someone else. So I guess the construction methodology is quite sensitive in terms of how it deals with the existing elements. So we're not putting in big concrete pads or removing any kind of any of their existing paving that they've got there on site.
So here's a render of the existing proposal.
The body of the water is coloured pink, sort of making direct reference to the many inland salt lakes in Victoria. And I guess highlighting the scarcity, importance, and I guess political implications of water as a fundamental yet increasingly scarce natural resource. The wildflowers, which you can sort of see beyond, will sort of bloom at different times throughout the installation. They sort of seek to highlight the beauty, precariousness, and temporality of the natural ecology, as well as inviting reflection on our future custodianship and care of the environment. And I guess sort of the last slide talks about sort of the space. So envisioned as a space that becomes part of the NGV garden rather than a separate architectural object. Ponder invites audience to move through a series of interconnected walkways and accessible platforms, and visitors will be able to sort of immerse themselves within and explore the spaces of flora and water. We can even step down and wade through the pink pond. So these were sort of taken last week. It has been a bit of a challenge, this project, just with COVID. Probably a lot of architects are dealing with this at the moment, just sort of restrictions on site, access to materials. But we're really excited with the way it's going, and we've got a really great team that we're working with. And yes, thank you again for giving us the opportunity to present tonight.
No worries. Thanks very much, guys. That was incredible. Now, as usual, we have some questions from the audience. So I'll get Ali to help me read some of them out tonight. I'll go first though. Guys, how do you go about striking a balance between preserving the more delicate and tectonic aspects offered within the heritage element of the project with the newer monolithic compartments found within the Fitzroy Terrace?
A really good question. It's sometimes about, I guess, finding the right place to create a really clean break between old and new, from a form point of view. Sometimes it's really easy. There's a natural point where perhaps the roof line ends and the lean-to starts. Any other thoughts on that?
I think, to put it simply, if it's good, we keep it. If it's not, we get rid of it. And I think you can quickly establish that when you walk through a project. stuff that's been well built, we try and keep, and we will try and do that as much as we can. Something that has been built by a craftsman, we'll take that and we'll try and keep it, and then we'll try and make sure that however we respond to it, we kind of use those motives to tie in a contemporary way. Like the Melbourne Garden House with the brick detailing and the concrete corbelling. Another house we did in Ascot Vale, it was built by a carpenter for his own house, and it had, a lot of the doors and the fireplaces had this beautiful kind of curved motif through it. And so we kind of used that motif and tried to, work that into the contemporary design. So it became a kind of common thread, which, married this old and this new together. But I think that often you can pretty quickly establish, what's worth keeping and what's not. And that's just by, how it stands when you go through it and what it looks like. If we can keep it, we'll keep it, essentially.
Yeah, we tend to try to, I guess, minimise the building footprint in most of our projects. We don't always go for big. We're always about sort of quality over quantity. But sometimes I think you do need to, I guess, be strategic in, what you pull down, because I think some of these places, you need to kind of, they do lack kind of amenity, and I guess it's about bringing it in a very sensitive way. So even though there was quite a bit of demolition at Fitzroy Terrace, it was done in a way which you could never tell from the street. So I guess we sort of maintained the quality of the streetscape, but increased the amenity of the spaces beyond.
Some of the walls in the Fitzroy Terrace too, we originally set out to keep. So some of the boundary brick walls, for example, that wrapped around the courtyard, the ambition was to keep it because it looked like it was in good enough condition to sort of tie new walls into it. But what we found when we got on site is that the mortar just started to crumble. So what we ended up having to do was kind of rebuild that wall. And so the way that we rebuilt it was with the same kind of Flemish bond that the original building was built in. So they kind of, again, keystoned into the existing and tied together the old and the new.
Okay, the next question is, light seems to play a significant role in your design process. So do you believe that natural light plays a role in helping you determine the architectural scales of your project?
Yes, I think I understand your question. So the form and the spatial volumes respond to, I guess, getting natural light. I'd say, yeah, that is an approach that we do take in a lot of projects. You can see that in Fitzroy Terrace with that kind of that double height volume. It's not just for dramatic effect. It is to bring that natural light into the space. So yes, generally our spatial volumes, there's a key reason why they are, they have that particular height or that shape. It's to generally get natural light in or create a certain sort of spatial experience.
I guess from our perspective, we always start with the kind of key architectural principles, and that's kind of, really based around kind of orientation, facing north where we can, how we can kind of control the sun and the movement of it. I think light is one of those things which, you need in order to perceive space. So we do always try and work with it. And I think even from the very beginning, in our very first project, light played a significant part. And I think at that point, we might not have been as aware of it when we were kind of, playing with it and thinking about form. It was almost quite intuitive within some of the kind of initial designs. But I think that the more that we've started to, test and refine our architectural approach, I would say that light does play a significant part. And because of the kind of immense beauty that it can bring, through changing the amount of light can, completely change, how a room is perceived. And so, and not only that, how a material is perceived as well, and talking about, Fitzroy Terrace House is a classic example, because, you know, if you didn't have that north-facing skylight, but you had, you know, the dags of the concrete coming through the curved ceiling, you know, say you only had a southern skylight, you wouldn't get the same kind of light quality or light play that you get, the drama, exactly, that you get. You need that materiality and light to work together. And so there's always kind of a bit of a skillful dance that you need to do between that in order to kind of make sort of beautiful and sort of poetic architecture.
The psychological benefits of glass, I think, are very well, not glass, light, very well. There's a lot written
researched.
Yeah.
Okay. There's one here from Nick. What makes you decide to use a more modern or contemporary look versus keeping with the styles of the existing house?
If the existing house is there, then we'll try and you know, and it's got beautiful bones, then we'll try and showcase it, highlight it, you know, make it as beautiful as what it was. I guess our design approach is very much
for contemporary architecture.
Yeah, about doing stuff that's contemporary. You know, using modern construction techniques and kind of ideas, and, you know, having that to offset against some of these heritage spaces. And often we find that by offsetting it, you know, you create a really beautiful juxtaposition between, you know, the old and the new. And often because you've got the old and the new, they kind of mediate off one another. And so that the experience of walking into something that's kind of contemporary and open and full of light is very different to kind of coming through something that's, you know, heritage and insular, and, you know, it's got a very different quality. And I think you can kind of play off those two different types of architecture and different styles.
Yeah. I'd say we're not like I guess Pete and I, we personally hate the word style. We probably, because it associates, it's a very simple approach, like whereas all our work is very site responsive in a way. So not so much concerned about aesthetics at the start. It's all about kind of design that creates really beautiful and enjoyable spaces. So the form and the layouts are always response to existing conditions and opportunities that we have. And we find the form just follows. I guess the aesthetics sort of come later. We certainly work in plan and section, and we don't sort of even look at what it looks like till later in the project.
Yeah, I think because originally we kind of set up the framework, you know, we kind of take a very linear approach to design. And part of that is first about establishing, you know, what's happening on the particular site that we've been asked to look at or design. And then the response kind of comes out of that based on its attributes or its constraints on site. And so it's kind of quite pragmatic and linear in our process. We don't think about kind of, you know, throwing or adopting a style on a particular bit of architecture. We kind of let the language kind of, you know, we kind of arrive at a particular point where the language comes because of the linear process that we go through, that we're building on each stage through, you know, creating the framework and responding to that, and then developing it, and going into detail, and then kind of refining it.
We tend to, every project tends to look, is quite unique, and I think that's because of every client is different, every site is very different, having a very site responsive approach, and I think early on we're very conscious of, you know, when we get a new project, not jumping straight in, but really sort of doing research and really sort of looking at what's sort of possible with that kind of typology. How can we sort of approach it in a different way? How have others approached it? And so we can sort of put our unique take on that particular project.
And I think that what that means is you're kind of not forcing something on a site as well. You know, if you've got a particular idea that you kind of want to impose on a particular site, well, you are imposing it. Whereas what you need to do is kind of like establish the rules for each site, and each site has its own set of rules. And so you kind of need to respond and build on that. And therefore everything looks different. You know, every project is different because, you know, it's starting from, establishing what are the rules of that site and then building on it.
But I suppose all the projects, I guess, have similar kind of, I guess, qualities in terms of like really good natural light, connection to garden, landscape. Yeah, and I guess quite playful kind of interiors and engagement with the garden too.
Okay. Based on what you have mentioned about working on renovations and extensions, do you find you're more excited to work with the constraints of those pre-existing buildings, or do you enjoy the freedom of a blank site?
I personally like parameters. I do like a budget. Yeah, constraints are quite good. I think it's a lot more open-ended, a project where there is less restrictions from planning, construction budget. I think a lot of projects that have those strong parameters, they tend to be really strong pieces of architecture. Not that, sort of on those sites where you don't have anything, it can't be, but I think they force you to be very, very creative and innovative.
I also think that every site will always have parameters. It's just the kind of the degree of the parameter too. Every site is unique. It's gradient, it's topology, it's orientation. If you don't have parameters, then you need to kind of establish them. And that's probably part of our original kind of concept, is kind of first establishing that and then working out how to respond.
Yeah, I think having, where you don't have it, it's really important to have really strong conceptual framework to sort of guide the project through.
But I guess if you take the example of Fitzroy Terrace, that had very strong parameters. And I guess because of that, it does force you to think quite creatively and kind of respond to it. So they can become kind of good catalysts to kind of enable you to kind of keep massaging and kind of refining the design process.
Okay, there's one from Vanessa. Hi, James and Peter. That was an incredible lecture. What advice would you give recent or upcoming graduates? And what are the key values held by all architects at Taylor Knights?
What was the first one?
What advice would you give recent or upcoming graduates?
I guess every graduate's very different, and you'll have when you've gone through your 5 years at uni, you'll have different interests, and I imagine you'll have a pretty strong idea of what area of kind of practice you want. I guess the advice that we have is sort of for our path is going into kind of smaller and mid-sized practice where you can get responsibility on full projects. I think it's really important to, I guess, almost have like an apprenticeship where you kind of learn all the tools, you understand each of the stages. When you move into a bigger practice, yes, they might have better kind of perhaps processes, and they're much bigger and work on bigger, more exciting, possibly projects. But you don't get that, I guess, that whole sort of experience where you work on a project from start to end. You generally work on small parts of a project. So I guess your knowledge base is perhaps better if you work in a small to mid-sized practice. I think it sort of gives you a really good grounding to, move into those bigger practice.
I think as well, to be an architect, I think you really need to do it because you're deeply passionate about it and you care about it, especially if you want to create, beautiful work. It's a hard slog, but it's a very rewarding one. And I think that you need to be really passionate about it, and you need to really kind of invest in it. And I think that's the way to kind of really kind of create beautiful architecture. And I think that, you know, establishing, I mean, you might not know what kind of architecture you kind of like or what you want to work in, or, you know, the kind of area of architecture that you want to go into. And it is incredibly broad. Like there's many different kind of, you know, areas of architecture that you can go into, whether it's a design architect, a documenter, you know, you can become a specialist that just works in facades, you know, like you can do kind of a lot of different areas. But I think importantly, you kind of got to really kind of care about what you're creating, the community, and know why you're in it. Because I think that often you need to be really invested in order to kind of do beautiful work.
Yeah. Further to that, I think getting construction experience is really valuable. So if you even labour work with a builder, I graduated from Deakin at the end of 08. It was sort of like GFC, so it was pretty bleak. But I actually at the time I wasn't interested in sort of getting an architect's job. I was really keen because of my thesis, getting a carpentry job. So that's what I did straight out of uni, and I sort of did that for about 18 months. I sort of started an apprenticeship and sort of worked on the tools, and that was sort of fantastic because it sort of given me a great respect for trades and understanding the processes that happen, and a really good understanding of constructability. So kind of what, you know, how to make things and think about the making too, and how, you know, how easy it can be. So getting construction experience, I think, is a fantastic idea if you can. And there's you know, you can do a pre-apprentice course, or you can just work with a labourer if you want as well. It's another way.
Okay, thank you. And this is a question from Jake. Looking at the scale of your concepts, how many conceptual iterations do you go through at the beginning of a project to ensure that you have the most practical solution?
We typically, as a practice, our conceptual process, we typically only present 1 or 2 plans. But the way we work on sketch paper, we probably would go through 10 to 15 different plan layouts. We go through quite a lot, which we'll sketch out, but we tend to not go through those with a client unless there's a really strong reason to. As we go through the process, there's a lot of rigor. There's a lot of kind of discussion around the ideas, and we usually find we sort of end up with a plan that, you know, we think's perfect. And look, to be honest, if we're having issues with the client after sort of 2-3 meetings, we're probably not the right architect for them. So, but yeah, we tend to present just the one. I do know other architects that present multiple, but yeah.
Okay, there's one from Linda. How much do you consult with landscape designers when scoping your ideas or plans?
We tend to get involved with them sort of at the end of concept design. We don't always get them engaged by clients, but we certainly encourage clients to get a landscape designer involved. We think it adds incredible sort of value to a project.
Okay, and this is a question from Aaron. You've shown a range of projects that work to different scales, from the private scale to the public scale. What scale projects do you enjoy working on the most / see the firm working on in the future?
I think we like all scales really. What makes an enjoyable project is usually the client. Is usually the you know, what makes it truly enjoyable. I mean, it's a relationship, and you're on a journey together for a good couple of years. From concept to completion, you could be drawing a circle around 2 to 3 years. So it's a long journey. So kind of more important to scale is kind of the relationships that you have with, with your client and your fellow consultants. We try and be quite a collaborative studio. And so we kind of, we all work on stuff quite collaboratively and collectively. And I think that, the size of our projects now, range from the smallest project is probably a 20 square meter extension up to like a 700 square meter house. So like they're vastly different, but they're both super enjoyable because the clients are amazing. And we're pretty fortunate that we seem to get really amazing clients. And so I think because, you've got an enthusiastic client that loves what you do, that kind of enjoys, what you bring to the design process. I don't think it matters so much about the size of it, because that what you're contributing to is kind of bringing kind of joy to that person and to, how that person will live. And so whether it is 20 square meters of, something that's highly refined or something that's larger, they're kind of both enjoyable scales. They just have different challenges.
Yeah, I think the smallest we've got is a 6 meter extension. So like
six, is it?
Yeah, we in Fitzroy. So we do all scale. I guess diversity is nice, really. I think any kind of career or any job that you do, it's nice to have different projects. Big projects take longer. There's a lot more information to sort of absorb. So small projects, they sort of move through a little bit quicker, which can be really nice. So
I think for us as well, I think, like the design process, I think establishing a business in architecture takes a very similar linear process. And so often, we would never get a look in on bigger projects. It was always small kind of alterations and additions. And that was very much where we kind of started. Now we kind of do get people coming with kind of bigger scale projects that are new builds. We've got coastal work. So we're starting to kind of get a more diverse range of work. And I think in the future that will probably just continue to grow. Still try and have a good kind of collective, diverse projects. So small scale, up to some larger kind of more commercial scale projects as well. But I think importantly, we really want to just maintain our approach, regardless of the kind of scale. And that approach is very much a kind of a design-driven one that, is kind of, responding in a way that is, is highly considered to context and to site and to kind of connection with place. And I think that, regardless of the size, as long as we can kind of keep our core principles, which, we really want to, and certainly kind of our aspiration as a company, then I think that it doesn't matter that the size of the projects are enjoyable, whether it's small or large.
It's just all about quality in terms of output.
All right. Well, that's all we've got time for tonight. I'd like to thank James and Peter again for joining us here with another real lecture. Next week, we've got Richard Francis Jones from FJMT with a lecture entitled Small Truths and Lies in Architecture. So make sure you visit us again next Tuesday. Lastly, if you're feeling inspired and need more Real Lecture content, you can stay up to date with us on the Real Lecture Facebook and Instagram accounts and on our blog. You can also watch previously recorded lectures on YouTube. And that's all from us, and we'll see you next week.